Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Minnesota State Park Hiking Club Trail Series. Today we traveled to Starbuck, Minnesota to take the hiking club trail at Glacial Lake State Park. Part of a significant win for the citizens of Minnesota, Glacial Lake State Park was established in 1963 alongside the likes of Maplewood, Great River Bluffs, Sakatah Lakes, and several others in a single piece of omnibus legislation. The primary habitat is open prairie, which once stretched over a large swath of Minnesota. The DNR website on the park reports that only 0.1% of the prairie remains in Minnesota. That is why it is so important for state parks with native prairie grass lands remaining to be preserved, such as Blue Mounds and glacial lakes. Part of the geology of the park is the glacial hills that reside within it to create the rolling prairie. It's part of a 10 to 19 mile wide band that extends from Detroit Lakes to Wilmar, deposited when glaciers moved through and tore up the existing bluffs. This is the only area in the state with this land feature. The park does sit on a transition zone between the prairie and hardwood forest biomes, so there is some decent forest sections of the park, more dense forest than similar transition parks like Rice Lake. A fascinating fact about the park is the signalless lake is a fresh, clear waters are preserved because its entire watershed is within the bounds of the park. This means that any water that comes into it originates within the park's grounds, so it comes from a protected area. A cool fact with an even cooler result. The lake is swimmable and fishable. The fish in the lake are walleye, northern pike, bass, and panfish. There are only electric motors allowed, but boating is allowed on the 56-acre lake. It's relatively shallow, though, with a maximum depth of only 13 feet. The wildlife at the park consists of small mammals. The largest outside of deer you'd expect to see is a coyote. Otherwise, there are beavers, raccoons, and similar forest and prairie creatures. You'll likely see a pileated woodpecker, among several other species of birds. Birds and animals aside, there were large ant mounds as well. Not typically what people are looking for, but if you ever stop to look at a large ant mound, it can be quite mesmerizing. The hiking club trail first starts in the forested environment. The bugs were light to moderate overall, with some sections having hardly any, while some, particularly the north forested slopes of the hills, were quite buggy, and we nearly had to run through the terrain to avoid being swarmed. These sections are brief, but a fair warning is warranted. The trail takes you along the southern side of Signalless Lake, and there's a spot on the trail that gives you a pretty solid view of the lake from a wooden bench. It's out in the sun, so the bugs at this spot are minimal, and on some days there's a pretty solid breeze to keep you cool. Also in this stretch of the trail, there's some lowland and wetland sections that require a footbridge to pass over, first before and then after the overlook. The section after the overlook is longer and a thicker, more developed wetland. The next portion of the trail follows along the ridge of the hill, only briefly touching the forest at some points, but mainly staying on just the edge of the forest so you can have decent views of the surrounding area. Eventually, you start to ascend to higher points, and the views get better until you reach the peak, which has a nice bench for you to sit and take in the great scenery. This next part of the trail is where the thick bugs come in as you hike on the wooded north section of the hill. You'll want to keep a good pace and ensure you've taken the pause at the overlook to apply bug spray, or as I occasionally do, put on a sweatshirt to keep the bugs off. The forest itself is beautiful, with an array of oak and other trees that have gnarled and expansive branches that create a substantial canopy, but not substantial enough to prevent low-level brush that covers the forest floor and provides cover for the wildlife. I'd keep an eye out still, as you may be able to see a deer in the forest, but they'll likely spook once discovered. The forest eventually relents, and you find yourself back in the rolling prairie that you passed along on your way up the hill, although this time on the far side. You descend slightly towards a small body of water within the prairie. This section in particular, we heard a chorus of bird songs as they played amongst the prairie grass and along the water's edge. The trail then meanders over several hills before curving back to the split prior to the large hill. My favorite part of the hike is the overlook at the highest point in the park. It gives a good view of the surroundings. It's not a typical peak you'd think of, say, a barren or towering mountain peak, but this habitat, it treats you to, I could easily imagine being an overlook of Hobbiton with the rolling grassy hills. Watching the grass blow in the wind is a peaceful scene, and I made sure to take it in. Thank you for watching, and if you like this edition of the series, like and subscribe. Also, let us know which state park you'd like to see next.